Hey everyone, I'm Nick, and welcome to version 2 of C++ Crash Course. So in this episode of the series, we're going to be talking about scope. So let's go ahead and get started. So when we're talking about scope, we're talking about where is it valid to access a piece of memory. And for something like this statement in x is equal to 10, what we're really asking is where is it valid to access, say, this integer. Now when we have, say, something like a function, like our main function, the scope of this function is denoted by these curly braces. So we have a starting curly brace up here by int main, and we have one at the very bottom. And if we declare a variable inside of our main function, like this int x is equal to 10, the lifetime of this variable will start when we declare it up here, and it will end after it goes out of scope, or basically when the scope of this main function ends. And that's true of any of our functions. Now there are exceptions to when memory goes out of scope. It doesn't necessarily go out of scope when a function ends. And we'll talk about that more when we talk about heap allocation versus stack allocation. So not only can we have a single scope here, like the scope of our main function, we can have nested scopes as well. So when we have, say, something like a conditional statement or a for loop or a while loop, right, we create another scope here, right? So the scope of basically within this condition. So you see we've got more curly braces here, and if I can declare another integer. So here I make an integer y is equal to 5, and I print out the value of y down here. But I can't print out the value elsewhere, right? So outside of this if statement, if I try to print it out, you see it's going to give me an error basically saying y was not declared within this scope. So the lifetime of y ends at this ending curly bracket right here. Now, there's other little nuanced things that you can do with this. So I can even have an integer of the exact same name as one in the outer scope, right? And that's perfectly okay, right? So, you see here it gets rid of all the errors. So I can have an integer x within this if statement scope, and also within my main scope in here, right? So here I've got my int x is equal to 10, and here I have another integer. So this is a completely separate piece of memory, and I'm setting this integer x is equal to 5. Now, kind of a catch here is you can't access this, external integer anymore. Normally, if we had, say, something like both of these being y, I could print out x here as well, right? So if I go ahead and, print out x here, that's going to compile without, any kind of errors. Here you see I've got a little warning here because y is unused, but I can access things in an inner scope. The one kind of catch is if I go ahead and change this to be x, right? So if I have int x is equal to 5 here, then I can't access this external integer here. It basically gets overridden by the one in this internal scope. So we can have these nested scopes. We also have scopes, right, with other functions. So here I have a function called printx, and we see that I can even declare another integer. So this int x is equal to 0. And this is separate from the one that's down here in my main function, separate from the one in this if statement, etc. They're all different integers, right? And this one is only valid within this function call, right? So we create this integer for this function call, we print it out, and then we don't use it anymore. That's the lifetime of this integer for this function call. So we have one more different type of scope to talk about, and that's global scope. So up here you see I have a variable that's not within any function, it's not in our main function, and this is an integer that's at global scope, and this can be accessed anywhere. So how do I access this this integer from anywhere? Well, one way that we could access it, right, if we didn't have any other variables named x, if we just use x inside of our code, that would refer to the one at global scope. If we are using integers named x, say inside of our main function in this case, I can use the scope resolution operator. If I just use : x, this says I want to access the x that's at global scope, right? So that's how I'd access it if I have, conflicts. And I could really do that anywhere, right? So, inside of, this if statement right here, I could use, the global int x. Inside of this function here, I can go ahead and print out the global integer x. All of those things are valid, right? I can access that global from any of these places. So that's going to go ahead and do it for this quick example. So let's go ahead and just, you see if we go ahead and compile this, right? So scope.cpp, and we go ahead and run it. You see that the x that we have in our main function, we set the value to 10, so we get that printed out. The value of x we get in our nested scope, so the one that was inside of that if statement, it has a value of 5, so that's a different integer. The one inside of the scope of our function has a value of 0, again a different scope. And then the x at global scope, it has that value of 15, so different than any of the other three. Right? So that's a little bit about scope. We'll be going into this more when we start talking about, like I said, stack versus heap allocations, and also what happens when, say, something a little more complicated, like an object, so something like, it could be an STL container, like a vector or an array, or even one that we make ourselves, what happens when those go out of scope versus, say, an integer. But that's going to go ahead and do it for this video. As always, you can find all of this content at github.com/coffeebeforearch under CPP Crash Course. This is under Fundamental Concepts, Memory, and Scope. So go ahead and feel free to download this, check it out. Let me know if you have any questions, and as always, I'm Nick, and I hope you have a nice day.